Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here, and I understand we have a great audience that is live streaming the event as well. So it's my privilege to welcome you to the Newberry Library. I'm Estrida Orley Tantillo. I'm president and librarian of the Newberry. And this is an event that we really look forward to and celebrate. And we are so glad that you were able to be here for the 2025 Pattis Family Foundation Chicago Book Award and our storytelling event. We are very grateful to the Pattis Family Foundation and the Chicago Free for All Fund at the Chicago Community Trust for their generous support of this event. Today, we celebrate the power of storytelling and the vibrancy of our city, and the Newberry is a perfect venue for such a celebration. The library houses a vast and ever-growing collection chronicling human history from the first century until today. And while the collection remains global in scale, we have a remarkable collection and topics that feature Chicago and the Midwest. And so we're really particularly happy to be celebrating those topics today, as our storytellers and the books that we'll be celebrating will tell you. I think you'll come away from today's event with a better sense of how we cultivate learning and curiosity for all. Chicago's storytelling event has roots in the Bughouse Square debates, which many of you may remember or have heard about. And these were founded in the Newberry in 1986 at the urging of authors Studs Terkel and Arthur and Lila Weinberg. Bughouse Square, as Washington Square Park is famously known, was once a cow pasture where farmers would bring their cattle for water. Over the years, it transformed into a dynamic gathering place that encouraged freedom of expression. Today, we build on that legacy by inviting our speakers to share their stories with us today. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Mark and Lisa Pattis to join me. Mark and Lisa were instrumental in helping create the Pattis Family Foundation Chicago Book Award at the Newberry Library in 2021. The award is presented annually to a book that transforms the public understanding of Chicago, its history, or its people. Through their love of reading, Mark and Lisa have shown a commitment to the power of books, and we are quickly amassing a list of go-to Pattis Award-winning works that will stand the test of time. And I will say that you should all look at the books that have previously won, because it really is a remarkable collection of books across genres. This award helps the Newberry share its mission and vision with others through works that celebrate inquiry and the experiences of everyday Chicagoans. The Newberry is grateful to Mark and Lisa and the entire Pattis family for their support and vision. We now invite Mark and Lisa to share a few words about the award.
Hi, I'm Mark Pattis.
I'm Lisa Pattis.
We're delighted to be working with the Newberry Library. This is the fourth year of the award. Both of us are lifelong Chicagoans, very committed to Chicago, and it is our hope and expectation that this award, over many, many years, will sort of highlight the diversity of Chicago and all of its nooks and crannies. We hope that decades from now, people will look back at the books which have won the award or been recognized as runners-up as a real collection, sort of highlighting this city and its diversity.
We wanted to just take 1 minute to thank the Newberry staff who are working with the award, who have done the hard work, or delightful work, as the case may be, of sorting through the large number of nominees with all kinds of books, as Mark said, from all kinds of genres about the city. And then we also want to thank the selection committee, which did the really arduous work of choosing amongst all of those to recognize our runners-up and our winners today. It really is, we sit and watch and don't have the burden of doing that, but it really is a real pleasure to watch how the committee works through recognizing just a very few among a large number of awards. So thank you very much to everyone, both on the Newberry staff and on the committee, for all your work on the selection process this year and in the future.
Thank you, Srita.
And so now it's really our pleasure to introduce to you both the shortlist recipients and the winner of this year's award. So first, this year we have two shortlist recipients. The jury panel recognizes Larry A. McClellan, author of Onward to Chicago, Freedom Seekers and the Underground Railroad in Northeastern Illinois, and Sandra Steinbrecher and The Salt Shed, The Transformation of a Chicago Landmark. We welcome Larry and Sandra to the stage together. And let me tell you a little bit about the books, and then we'll do the award ceremony. So originally constructed in 1929, the Morton Salt Shed and Warehouse Complex has been a familiar and beloved Chicago landmark along Elston Avenue between Division Street and North Avenue. The Salt Shed tells the story of the building's reimagining and transformation into a stunning music venue. Sandra spent nearly 2 years documenting the deconstruction, reconstruction, and reinvigoration of this classic industrial Chicago building, and it's absolutely a beautiful book. For Larry's book, decades before the Civil War, Illinois' status as a free state beckoned enslaved people, particularly those in Kentucky and Missouri, to cross porous river borders and travel toward new lives. While traditional histories of the Underground Railroad in Illinois start in 1839 and focus largely on the romanticized tales of white men, Larry reframes the story, not only introducing readers to earlier freedom seekers, but also illustrating that those who bravely aided them were black and white men and women. And so now let us do the award ceremony. And now it is my honor to welcome to the stage the recipient of the 2025 Pattis Chicago Book Award, Scott W. Berg, for The Burning of the World, The Great Chicago Fire, and the War for a City's Soul. The Burning of the World is a gripping and deeply researched account of our city's most destructive catastrophe and the long process of rebuilding in the wake. The book provides new insight into how Chicago's Gilded Age story has been told. As soon as the battle against the fire ended, another battle for the future of the city erupted between its entrenched business establishment and its poor and immigrant laborers and shopkeepers. And so now, let us invite Scott to the stage to receive the Pattis Book Prize. All right, and now it's my pleasure to start the program part and the entertaining part of the conversations that will ensue based upon the books and other Chicago storytellings. And it is really my pleasure to introduce to you now Chicago's legendary Chicago newspaper man, Rick Kogan, who will serve as the MC for today's program. Rick earned his first byline in the Chicago Sun-Times at the age of 16 and has been a mainstay of Chicago journalism ever since. Uh-oh, I'm in trouble now.
From Mars, you don't want to hear this.
Well, I'm going to finish. So he has a long history with the Newberry. He's a great friend of the Newberry, and we definitely have to acknowledge that. In fact, the library holds the papers of his father, Herman Kogan, who spent 50 years covering the city of Chicago, many with the Chicago Daily News and Chicago Sun-Times. So it's definitely a family tradition of friendship for the Newberry. Please welcome Rick Kogan.
How many people here are veterans of the what I now refer to as the good old raucous days of the Bughouse Square debates? What? Wait a minute, are you serious? Where did all you people come from then? Don't you remember when we do this sort of outdoors and people would scream at each other and people would fight about, whether you could smoke in restaurants or not, big issues like that. You were there? Did you enjoy it? I do this. My duties are absolutely minimal here. The reason I'm doing this is I do love the Newberry. When I come here, I am imbued with what it was like when this room was the setting for my father's memorial service in 1989, and I get to think maybe even more intensely of my dad. But everything is a story, and I'm thinking of that and thinking of Irv Kupson, one of the many speakers at my father's memorial service, beginning. I loved Cup, but he began, the stage was over there, and he began on stage speaking to the windows, talking about my father. He had gotten confused, and he said Rick Kogan was one of the great lights of the sporting world and politics, and don't we all miss him? Essie, his wife, kept saying, "Turn around, you idiot, turn around." It brings up, Peter Orner has just written a novel. Tell me if anybody's heard of this novel. It's called The Gossip Columnist's Daughter, about the murder of Cup and Essie's daughter in 1963, a week after the assassination of Jack Kennedy. I don't ever want to tell my new friends, Lisa and Mark Pattis, what to give for a book award. This year's three selections are incredible to my mind. Do not give Peter Orner's novel a Pattis Award, please. That's my ultimately short but snappy review of the book. What we're doing is there are going to be conversations up here, and I think all the people coming up will, Paul Durica included. Paul is, if you don't know, the other three you have seen. You'll get to know them a little better. Paul, to my mind, runs the Chicago History Museum. He may have some lesser title involved. He's one of Chicago's great historians. He's contributed a piece to Sandra's amazing book. He'll be part of this, but we're going to start, and these are all supposed to be 10 minutes long conversations. And I've known authors for my whole life, and including studs. You can't make them shut up. So that's basically my chore, is to say, hey, that's been very interesting, fellas. 9 minutes, let's go. First, I'd like to welcome up here to begin this thing, Scott and Larry.
Is that good? Okay.
And that works. Well, we're on stage.
We're on stage now and on film. I wanted to say, we want to say thank you to Rick first. From my own point of view, I wrote a book about, the Great Chicago Fire, and anybody writing a book about the Great Chicago Fire has to contend with the remarkable legacy and work on the Great Chicago Fire of Herman Kogan, of Rick's father, but not only that. As a journalist, I spent about 15 years as a freelance writer for the Washington Post, and so I'm connected in that way to Rick's experience as well. So we want to say a huge thank you to him for being here, because as I asked him about 5 minutes ago, have you done 1,000 of these events, or have you done 5,000 of these events? And so to be here and to be invested and to know the books as well as he done. So if you could all give Rick a big hand.
Yes, yes.
So we were told we've been in communication, all of us, not to sort of rehearse our conversations, but at least to pick some topics. And we actually, even though it's the two of us starting, we're starting with a topic that sort of was inspired by Sandra's book, which is about the salt shed, and but that book is really about the peeling back of layers of history, which you do literally when you're talking about a building, and especially about the restoration of a building. And of course, the process of research and the process of trying to understand the past is also a peeling back of layers. I have a connection to a good friend of mine. I guess I'm going to plug here. A good friend of mine is Fergus Bordewich, who wrote the book Bound for Canaan, which is sort of a comprehensive history of the Underground Railroad. But when I learned that I would be speaking to Larry and that Larry's excellent book had been shortlisted for this award, I went to because I remember reading Fergus's book more than once, and I went to the back into the index and said, I don't remember a lot about Chicago in there. And indeed, when I went to the back of the book, there was, I think, no entries from Chicago.
No, not for Chicago. One for Illinois.
One for Illinois, none for Chicago. And when I was doing research for my previous book, 38 Nooses, which is set in Minnesota and the Dakotas, and it's about the largest mass execution in American history, took place the day after Christmas, 1862, when 38 Dakota Indians were hanged on a single scaffold. And when I was doing that research, I came across there were maybe 40 to 50 persons of African descent in Minnesota at the time, and I was astonished to learn that even with the numbers that small, there was a small but active branch of the Underground Railroad in St. Paul during that time. And so then when I came to your book, I realized three things, and then I want to ask you about. I realized one is that the Underground Railroad started in Chicago the moment Chicago was born, in the 1830s. But the Underground Railroad, surprisingly, over the next 30 years, was not as underground as the name seems. I was astonished by the number of the people were talking about this, and then just the sheer numbers, the thousands of fugitive slaves that were moving through Chicago. And so I'm very interested in how that doesn't show up in a lot of histories. And of course, even though the Underground Railroad was reported in the newspapers, to my surprise, it's still trying to stay hidden. That's the whole point of an Underground Railroad.
Right.
And yet you write a very thorough and entertaining and extremely revealing and well-researched book. So I did want to talk about, when you're writing about the Underground Railroad, something that is trying to stay hidden, how do you peel back those layers?
Yeah, I think the peeling back, in a way, is reflected in all three of our books. And this has been a very interesting process, our talking together with Scott and with Sandra. And in very, very different ways, we've peeled back. In terms of the Underground Railroad stories, there's both been a construction project and a deconstruction project. That the construction project really has to do with how do we understand what happened when everything was illegal. The movement of freedom seekers coming up into Illinois and to Chicago was very illegal, and particularly after 1850, responding to freedom seekers was also a very illegal activity. So there's an interesting set of things that have to be looked at to construct that. And I'll touch on that in a second. But the other really powerful thing is that there is a deconstruction needed. And that we all today continue to live out of mythologies about the Underground Railroad. And it all stems from the fact that in the late 1870s, 80s, 90s, having been involved with the Underground Railroad was a very popular thing. And so all of these families, looking back, if they had an ancestor, a grandfather or whatever, who was involved in the abolitionist movement, of course they were part of the Underground Railroad. And what emerges in what some of us refer to as celebration histories is that a lot of history gets written at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century that I like to characterize as stories about old white guys written by old white guys. And there are some notable exceptions to that, but it really is a compelling fact that the folks were writing about that, and we have to unpack that. We have to reframe that. And so to construct the stories, we have to go back and first of all recognize the profound importance of the travels and the journeys of people on their way to freedom. In these romanticized stories that were written at the end of the 19th century, the presence of a fugitive slave becomes kind of a reason for telling this romantic story about this hero. But in point of fact, the people that were running for their lives are the engine of the whole story, because it is now clear that freedom seekers coming out of the South elicited responses, and over time those responses became the Underground Railroad. So we really have to shift it from seeing it a predominantly white activity that went and helped poor helpless folks into seeing it as a remarkable set of activities based on people who were seizing their freedom and heading north, and then people were responding. And so to get at that, First of all, in the celebration histories, there are pointers. And the whole activity I've been involved in has been almost like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. So you take the celebration histories, and there's a story of somebody being involved, and it maybe, by the way, points to some fugitive in the story. And so those become pointers. And then you then are looking at obituaries, and in the obituaries there are pointers. And then you're looking in the county histories around Chicago, and there are pointers. And you're looking at family memoirs, and there are pointers. And then the remarkable experience for me was digging very deeply into the Chicago newspapers, because throughout the middle of the 19th century, all this kind of glorious writing, as you found the same, I'm sure, that there was no constraints of neutrality or objectivity. It was, how do you tell the story? And so sifting through those stories and then beginning to discover, particularly in those stories and in the Western citizen stories, there are a lot of freedom seekers who are identified, and their stories are really there. And so it becomes a matter of putting all of these pointers together and coming up with what is a substantial story. Two of the other things that were really, really important for me were the papers of Wilbur Siebert. He wrote a fellow at the Ohio State University that wrote a kind of the first great book about the Underground Railroad in the 1890s. But what's crucial is that he corresponded with people all over the country. And so his archives contain all of these great letters and opinions and stories. And that proved to be, and a number of them were written by people that were escaping themselves. And so putting all of those pieces together and the census data to confirm if these people really existed in the Chicago region, and discovering that, of course, overwhelmingly they were from New England and New York, and they carried these kind of vague anti-slavery things. But then they were confronted by human beings on the run, and they had to decide whether or not they were going to break the law. And so kind of constructing those stories out of all those sources has been...
The saying goes that the history is written by the winners, and very often that's true. But what you discover, and what we're both sort of uncovering here, is that even more so than that, history is written by just the people who wrote things down. And that's not always necessarily the quote unquote winners. I mean, it's history. There are memoirs, for instance, from fugitive slaves. There are memoirs from, and I take Kate Leary in the Chicago Fire, and you learn a lot about a lot of people when you research the Chicago Fire, but the biggest surprises in writing about that for me in that were the story of the Leary family, and just the fact that in the inquest records and in the interviews, and she was never interviewed, but in the newspaper story, she was always referred to as Kate Leary. She was never referred to Catherine O'Leary, and that's in the book a little bit. But the entire story of whether she went by Leary or O'Leary is a very telling and interesting part of the story. But she's an example of somebody that was painted at the time as an immigrant hag, older woman, just incompetent, probably on the dole. She wasn't. She owned a bunch of animals. She had her own milk peddling business. They owned their house. It was a shack, but they owned it. And the shack right next to it was theirs as well, and they rented that out, so they were landlords. They were very different people than maybe the cliche says. But what's interesting about her, she was illiterate. She couldn't write, and yet she left this really interesting record in history because of her role in the Chicago Fire, which was minimal, other than the fact that it started on her lot. Because of that, she gets hauled in front of the fire commissioners and the police commissioners, and they leave behind these interviews. A notary public goes to her house to get a statement. All kinds of people talk to her. And so suddenly, someone like her enters the public record in a way that you didn't necessarily expect her to enter the public record in. And that's, I think, where our books sort of come together a little bit, is that there are stories about the people that left all the records behind.
Right.
And then there are stories that only enter the record because other people are talking about them, and you have to be very careful that you look for how other people are talking about them and why. You said that the later generations would lionize previous generations, but at least they're there, right?
Yes, yes.
At least
yeah.
they're there, and your job isn't so much to just repeat what you find verbatim. Your job as you go there is to decide, okay, why is she there? Who put her there into the record? And how do we consider the motivations and biases of the people who put these people there, and to be able to tell their stories? And once you add all that up and you're careful, you do have a real story to tell. The other thing that I want to sort of second that you said, Larry, is the role of Chicago newspapers and all this. I just want to tell everybody here who doesn't know, and most of you already do know, that Chicago was a journalistic wonderland in the 1870s. It was 7, 8, 9 English language newspapers, some popping up, some all disagreeing with each other, all wonderfully, partisan media can get annoying, but when you're researching 1870, it's wonderful because everybody's very clear about where they stand. And so
Right.
you understand that the people who read this newspaper felt more this way, the people who read this newspaper. And then I'll talk about this a little later when I talk with Paul, but also the foreign, because the Newberry is very involved in this, but for me at least, the foreign language newspapers that are cataloged here online are absolutely incredible. They have translations of them. So how are we on time?
I love the fact I've started
So we're
to feel.
happy to-
I've
you're gonna
started to
hear more
feel
from both
even
of
at one thing like some drunken MC at a comedy club. This conversation's fascinating, but to keep on track here, Scott, you got to get off the stage, and
I was looking at the clock.
and you're going to be replaced by Sandra Steinbrecher, who will sit here and talk to Larry some more.
Great.
And I'm sure I will hear other great phrases, but thank you so much for reminding me that Chicago once was a journalistic wonderland.
That
So-
is
oh,
that
thank
is
you.
the best.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here with us. It really is a lot of fun to be able to chat with these accomplished authors and studiers of history. And one thing I wanted to bring up is, which connects the three of our books, is the inspiration of hidden histories and reframing narratives, which Larry referred to, and obviously the peeling back of layers, but really telling stories about people who don't usually have their stories told. And so I did that in a visual manner and also through oral conversations and interviews. And Larry had other ways of getting his research done. But I wondered, partly what the value to you of the physical sites, visiting physical sites and also visiting archives where you actually touched and held original photographs.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. Part of what's happened 20 years ago, I used to hang out at places like the Chicago History Museum, where you could actually go through things and you could look at the maps and look at the Western Citizen and turn those giant pages. And there is something very powerful about that tactile engagement with all of that. But now it's almost all online.
Right. I think
Wonderful
what
archivists all over the
Yeah.
world are putting stuff up, and we just mine that.
Well, I think for my story, the narrative was directed directly from the photographs and what I was seeing and recording, and the story kind of came along later. So I wondered if photographs and visual records and visiting sites had any impact on the direction of your book and of the way that it, changed along the way.
The physical locations have had a great impact. When I was doing a lot of research, I started getting involved with deep research on the farm of Jan and Angie Tunn, which was located on the Little Calumet River. And it was being in that place and then doing tours and bringing other people to that place and getting a real sense of place was very, very powerful. And again and again and again, being in the place was a way that people could say, oh my God, that happened here. And that all of a sudden they could be open to the stories because this is literally in our backyard. Or we look at, Michigan Avenue in the middle of Roseland, more than 500 people on their way to freedom walked down Michigan Avenue. And that gets people excited. And that's kind of, oh my gosh. But to come back at you with that same question, I think that when I finished reading Sandra's book, my immediate reaction was, oh my gosh, the words are talking to the pictures and the pictures are talking to the words. And particularly the involvement of some of the workers, people that were doing that. And how did you get so embedded in that wonderful dynamic?
Well, so I, really just went for a morning to look at the site and take a few pictures.
And you get pulled in.
And I kind of never left. Nobody really wanted me there necessarily. A photographer on a construction site for the purpose of storytelling and not any other commercial purposes is not, anything that anybody really wants for a number of reasons. But what I saw was an opportunity to capture this work that was going on, to highlight a really unique piece of Chicago architecture that sort of stands in for many of our buildings through the years, and then also showcase the skills and craftsmanship of those who were doing the work. And that really focused on the laborers and the tradespeople. I did also, of course, interview architects and engineers and the developers who had the foresight to really try to work with this with Morton Salt to save the building, and being able to tell their stories through the photographs was really my inspiration. And then to do it justice, they were working hard. Their skills don't often get noticed. Their work gets covered under layers of gravel and concrete and paint, and they you walk in this beautiful space now and enjoy it and listen to music and dance, and you're seeing all the beauty and the finishes, but you don't see the work that went on. And I found that so beautiful and so dramatic, just people working. It carried me every day, really.
And that whole business about you see a place, and what you do is you're basically, how did this place get here? Who built it? Who made it? Right. Who created it? And that's I think what you give is kind of this powerful example of when we are in places, we should be doing that.
Right, and I am very interested in the power of place and the way we as citizens have a sense of belonging somewhere where we see, not just our modern buildings, but historic buildings that are the layers through the past that help us see who we are, right? And you're doing that too, and you are working on those the markers, right, for the freedom sites, and those are important, so people see the physical evidence of what came before and how we can be our best selves, to be inspired by the folks in your book, those stories. Paul and I were talking about how just, seeing everyday people do this kind of work is very inspiring.
I think that there is one of those kind of themes that the three of us share is this, for some reason, we all end up paying attention to just the regular folk.
Right.
And that are, that are responding to freedom seekers, that are building a building, that are trying to figure out what to do with this great fire, and that I think there's some real power in reminding us, kind of like everybody's in the story. It's not just our visible folks.
There's a quote in Scott's book, I won't get it right, I don't think, but it has to do with some of the more powerful people's, or the fire board, firefighters board. Scott, maybe you can help me. saying like they didn't really care about the public and what happened to the regular people. You can come up later and share that quote, but it really struck me as so, so much of what is wrong is when people think that way because, we're not separate. We all, get along together because we get along together.
Amen. How are we doing? I think we've gone 10 minutes, but I'm not sure.
I think not good if you look at me and say, how are we doing?
I meant time,
I can get you off
actually.
anytime I want. It's fascinating. I think this is an interesting format. I really do. And what I would like to, one comment after this is who has, $60, $80 million to start fixing up the Uptown Theater and hiring Sandra to catalog that.
Come on, Rich.
Sandra gets to stay. And who do you think is next up here? Paul Durica.
Yeah. Hey, Paul. Hey, Paul.
Hello. Hello. I just wanted to say quickly, it was a real honor this year to be a reader for the Pattis Prize, but I had to recuse myself when it came to your book, but I'm very happy to see that the other readers recognized its merits.
Thank you. Paul contributed a beautiful essay to the book if you haven't seen it yet.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, Paul is I was introduced to Paul, actually I introduced myself to Paul a couple of years ago. I heard a piece on WBEZ, a Curious City piece that he did about Joy Morton and the reconstruction of the salt shed. And I thought, I've got to talk to this person, and since found that he has so much knowledge and he's done so many interesting kinds of events and ways of engaging in history and getting people involved to really see the the fun and the benefits of doing that. And I thought, excuse me, maybe we could talk a little bit about the various, kinds of storytelling, the diverse ways we communicate with each other, and how you can make it come alive.
Well, yes. I mean, I feel that, one thing that I'm very captivated by when it comes to your book, and Larry was talking about this as well, is the way in which, there was one way that you could have gone about your project, which was just sort of like documenting the building itself, right, and focusing on it. But you were very much kind of interested in the social history, and you were there every day, and you were capturing images of people at work, and in a way, that's a gift to future people like me, because oftentimes it's those human traces that get erased, right, or removed. And that's also, what Larry and Scott and people like myself are really kind of looking for, because ultimately when we're trying to tell an interesting and compelling story, we're looking for people. And we're also looking for places too, right? Because that's what we feel often a strong connection to people and places. And you see that in your images.
Yes, I always think that I thought of the salt shed, the old Morton Salt Warehouse Complex, as it was known, as kind of a character in my story, but it only comes alive when people are there, and that's obviously architecture is, only works when people are in it, either working or playing or living. And our quality of life is directly related to the ways we can move through our communities and our buildings.
Well, I mean, I'll give you a good example, right? Probably that most people are familiar with. To contrast what you did with, one of the greatest events, or at least regarded as one of the most significant events in the city's history, and that's the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Now, that was an event in which the depictions of it were like highly controlled and managed. And today, we look back, and there are so few images of people actually at the World's Fair, right? We had no real sense of like how they actually experienced it, and then how it lived on in their memories. And I contrast that with something. I mean, one of the great things is you're always like learning something new, right? And that's one of the great things about being involved in this sort of line of work is currently working on an event with another Chicago treasure, Tim Samuelson, the city's former cultural historian. You might not be aware, but this year marks the 100th anniversary of the invention of the photo booth. And there are still a handful of old analog photo booths in Chicago that still have the chemicals in them, and you get the nice little strip with the images on black and white. And in preparing for that, I learned that there was an even earlier technology. It was called ping pong photography. And it was called that because basically the photographer would kind of shift this kind of 5x7 plate in front of the lens and captures these images of a people on this one plate that would basically be reproduced like a strip that looks very much like what comes out of a photo booth. And the point that I'm going to get at is that when you look at these images, which were taken roughly between 1900 and 1920, when photo booths started coming into 1925, when they came into development, is that it gives you a completely different way of understanding the first decade of the 20th century. Because most of what we see still at that point are very kind of formal portraits of people. But here in these ping pong photography images, oftentimes the photographer would have some props and costumes, and people would do silly things, or they would pose with friends. And you actually like see people like smiling and making different expressions or pretending to like call somebody on the phone. And it reminds you that these people, even though they're more than a century removed from us, were human beings just like us, right? With all of our foibles, all of our flaws, but all of our capacity for joy. And that's something that only like the visual record can preserve, right? You can't really get as much of that out of the written record.
Yeah, I love this story about ping pong photography, especially since I started my photography work and career in a dark room, and that informed a lot of what I do. And I think that there's the reason why all these various methods of telling stories and engaging with people about events in history or in real time, like I was doing, is to widen the circle of engagement and to widen the interests of folks. I mean, there's a million ways to be involved with the Morton Salt project. So the theme, I was actually blown away by how many themes came up. I was just photographing and capturing the action and not wanting to miss anything. But then I learned it was about trades and the labor movement. It was about the river and sustainability and the environment, and it was about the construction business and architecture and engineering and that steel frame. And so there's so many ways that people could be interested in just that one project and think of all the the stories that are out there. And so I also would celebrate the Newberry for celebrating storytelling and the power of books. And really what Paul has done is gather people in all kinds of ways, in kind of theatrical, outdoor programs and events, and he writes. And so I think it's a really good way to remember that you can talk to anybody or reach anybody and be inspired by events that either took place 100 years ago and more in Scott's and Larry's work, or just a couple of years ago at the salt shed, and the people who worked on that building getting some recognition and some credit for what they did too.
How are we doing on? Sorry, Rick.
How are we doing, Rick?
You're killing my enjoyment. I'm standing there, and nothing. All of a sudden, hey, Rick, what's going on? How are you people enjoying this too? I would think tremendously. Sandra, it's time for you to go sit down. And don't forget, after this, they're selling books, and every one of these books is worth whatever they cost, whatever minimal amount they cost. And having a book is not the same as reading a book online. It's simply not. Look, Scott snuck up here. The winner of our comedy contest, Scott, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Before we go any further, one more. We're applauding. I want another round of applause for not only the Pattis family, but the Pattis Foundation, please. I had a chance to get to know and talk with Lisa and Mark, and it's interesting because this marks a big event for the three authors here, and it's a very important honor. And are we happy to have been recognized? Absolutely, but the real gift here, in a way, is to the Newberry, and not to the three authors, because you know, we passed through. Will I write another book about Chicago? I don't know. Will the other two authors do another book about Chicago? Probably. Will they win this award again? I hope so, but I don't know what the rules are for the award, if you can win it twice. The point is that every year this does not only something for the authors, but something for the Newberry, and offers it sort of a recognition, but also sort of enters it into the conversation about Chicago history in an ever deeper, ever wider way. And I think that's what's really important. So speaking of places like the Newberry and the Chicago History Museum, one of the things that I want to sort of talk to Paul a little bit about here is the role of those museums in not only providing resources, but in creating their own history of a place. Because let me just suggest a proposition to you. If you ever hear anybody researching history like us talk too much about the joy of discovery and the serendipity of their historical research, you need to take it with a bit of grain of salt. And what I mean about that is we like to go in front of people and say, I uncovered a fact, I uncovered a document, look what I found in the archives, look at this incredible luck to come across this particular journal or letter, look at the way I did this detective work and I found it. Well, hold on, okay? You're making that discovery because somebody working at the Chicago History Museum or at the Newberry went and got that information, maybe purchased that information, maybe was donated, went to the registrar, they cataloged that information, they put it in an archive, in a file, they made sure that file was searchable, they made sure that there was a finding aid for that file, they digitized it in many cases. The amount of work that has to go in that's hardly serendipitous, but is very purposeful and sometimes a very lengthy process for that thing to be sitting in the archive is considerable. And so while yes, it's fun to make our discoveries, somebody has done a whole lot of work for us in an archive for us to be able to make that discovery. So long live the archivists, right? But what I wanted to talk to Paul about is, like one of the questions that I guess asked a little bit is, well, there have been other books about the Great Chicago Fire. Why a new one, right? And the answer to that question was, and this is, I think of Rick Kogan when I think of this. I think about like, well, if there's only one book to be written about the Chicago Fire, that's not very flattering to the event, is it? Right? I mean, the event is a lot bigger than the book I would write or anybody else would write. And so even though I'm trying to write something that captures a whole lot of the Chicago Fire, I'm still aware that it's sort of a snapshot of that event in a moment of time now when a certain amount of history is available to us, and we think certain ways about that history. So even though I feel like all those years of work and all those pages of work were sort of a lot of work, I think about it pales in comparison to what's actually happening in these museums, because Paul, in your capacity as sort of working with both the Newberry and the Chicago History Museum, like I think about the history of Chicago itself that's being created by those museums. And before I hand it over to ask Paul a question here, I want to say that one of the most important events in my research is when I got to this history museum and your Chicago Fire exhibit and the dioramas that you had in your main hall there. And one of the things that you're trying to do, you were talking about physical places, right? And one of the things that you're trying to do when you're writing about Chicago is just picture it. And it's one thing to picture it in 2D, right, in a painting or a drawing or something, but it's another thing to picture it in 3D, and suddenly I can go to the History Museum here and I can see diorama after diorama after showing how this bridge was situated on the river, showing how these crowds move. I mean, and whoever designed those dioramas was fabulous. I mean, it's hard to depict a fire in a diorama, but did an amazing job. And so that's telling its own story, never mind all the other pieces of Chicago history. So I think of, museums like this as not like a place where Chicago history is just kept for other people to find, but you're creating your own history of Chicago, and it's compared to our minimal histories that we're writing that have a page 1 end page, it feels kind of inexhaustible. So I wanted to sort of ask you, Paul, do you think of the work that way, as sort of creating this huge history of Chicago? And if so, how do you think of it that way? Because it seems so much bigger than what any of us are doing individually.
Well, thank you for that question. And I because I was, we prepared a little bit in advance, and I was trying to think about how I would respond to this. And I think the distinction between a book and, say, like a museum or a library, and the kind of telling of stories and telling of history, is that you've written your book, and now it's finished, and the text is fixed. And unless you produce a significant revision and the second edition comes out, it more or less is what it is. But it's now part of this like larger conversation about our understanding of the Great Chicago Fire. And what you find, I think, ideally, and in the best case scenarios with institutions like museums and libraries, is that they're always there in the present as well. The story is always unfolding. It's always changing. It's never a fixed story of Chicago, just as Chicago isn't a fixed place. And so our understanding of it is shifting all the time. And what's interesting is that the richness and then the depth of the collections can allow for those reinterpretations and then the expansion of those stories. Because there's so many things, as you probably are all aware, that have never been put on display, right, or have never been tapped before. And then you're always collecting as well. So what I think is really interesting when I look back at the history of an institution like the one where I am right now is you can see how like the story of Chicago has changed based on the moment in which you're living. And it's different stories at different times. And there is that kind of dynamism and that flexibility that I find really interesting. And you're always learning something new. I mean, it's interesting that you talked about all the work that museums have to do to preserving things, but what's also glorious is just like human beings, they're deeply flawed and they make mistakes and they lose track of records. And there's like so many things where like we don't know what they are or how they came into the museum. And weirdly, like one of them, and I know you did what we were talking about, like that thrill of discovery thing. But that the sense that you can always like learn something new. And I'll even give you an example from the Great Chicago Fire in our collection. So since at least probably the mid 1870s, the museum has had in its collection this little brass plaque that has the words of Frank Sherman embossed on them. It's maybe about like 5x7, and there was no record for it. Nobody knew how it ended up in the museum, where it came from. It was just mixed in with all these other objects related to the Great Chicago Fire. And for whatever reason, no one ever thought we had to switch some stuff out to put some new material in the case. And so it's like, well, let's see if we can kind of like figure out what this thing is finally. And so, we looked at the name, and thanks to your book and other resources, we were aware of the Sherman House Hotel, which gave us a good starting point. If you read certain first-person accounts of the Great Chicago Fire, there were people who were staying at the hotel who wrote about the incident. So we get that really lovely description of people observing the ash falling like snowflakes. And so we started, I started there, and I learned that Frank Sherman was Francis Sherman, who was the person who established the hotel, but had also been mayor of Chicago. And the object actually, at the end of the day, had nothing to do with the hotel. It was actually the brass plate from a steam-powered fire engine that had been used to combat the fire, that you could see if you went back and found old engravings of that steam-powered fire engine. And so that was just like this amazing little weird thing to finally actually be able to attach a story to. It had just been this random object. It had been sitting in the museum for 150 years. No one ever thought to ask what it was, but you can still go back and you can learn something new. And I think that's kind of the fascinating thing about any of these institutions, is that also anybody here can come and do research at the Newberry and perhaps connect to a story that's very resonant with the present, but that hasn't surfaced since the time that somebody made a donation to the institution.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a story that allows you sort of a way to enter into the event, like the Great Chicago Fire, a way to enter in sort of a tactile way, which is I think the most difficult thing for all of us. So I'm glad you found that. I mean, the fact that I find it interesting that you have them because one of the things I discovered in the process of writing the book, you discovered sort of the uniqueness of Chicago in terms of both during the fire itself and then after the fire itself. Sort of this weird morning that happened. Now, the morning wasn't weird, but along with the morning, this weird thing happens, which is that Chicago is in incredibly high spirits after the fire.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's buoyant. I mean, it's weird because we talked about this a little bit too. It's almost like Chicago starts with the fire,
Yeah, it
right? When
starts
you
with
think
the
about
fire.
like
There's
Larry.
a weird sense of possibility and high spirits. And so you talk about these little badges from the fire truck.
Mm.
And one of the most interesting discoveries I made is, first of all, after the Chicago burns, it becomes the tourist capital of America, right? And I think about this. I taught a unit, I teach at George Mason University, and I taught a literature class on the literature of Hurricane Katrina. And that was really the thing that sort of launched. I'd always been interested in Chicago fire, but when I was looking at the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and I saw all these parallels between the aftermath, and one of the things is the tourism business.
Right.
And if you've ever watched the HBO series Treme, you'll know there's a scene in there where for a couple of years, the Lower Ninth Ward and all these incredibly devastated places in New Orleans, there were companies doing bus tours of these, right? The devastated region of New Orleans. And I think about, like, you could get a bike tour, you could get a carriage tour, you could get a walking tour of the Chicago burn district, and people would walk you around. And in addition to that, the artifacts of the Great Chicago Fire, the business in selling artifacts of Great Chicago Fire was a huge business.
And to bring it full circle, and we're almost out of time, because you're talking about tourism in the aftermath of the fire, and where we are right now was actually one of the stops on the tour. Because we're on the site of the Mahlon D. Ogden Mansion, which was one of the few structures right within the fire's path to actually survive the Great Chicago Fire. And so people would come here to see it. And at the time of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, they actually printed a full-color lithograph of the Ogden Mansion the week that the fire opened, or that the World's Fair opened, as like a souvenir for people coming to the city to have an image of it. But of course, by that point in May of 1893, the mansion had already been torn down to make way for the building of the Newberry, where we are today.
Yeah,
so it all comes together at the end.
And that's I've got 2 minutes. I think of that, and I think about what high spirits. Like one of the things that the sort of business class, the elites of Chicago, tried to do after the fire, to sort of like take advantage of the fire, never let a good disaster go to waste, was to try to close the saloons on Sunday. And the city broke out in a celebration. The working class of the city broke out in a celebration of beer and drinking like you've never seen. They had a Sunday where basically the entire working class of Chicago all spent all day in the saloons and basically dared the police to do anything about it. And that's the high spirits I'm talking about, and also the sense of like opportunity that came with the fire. I think of, so if there were as many pieces of the true cross as people say there were, the cross would have been 75 feet tall. And it's interesting, people selling the courthouse bell melted in the courthouse, and people selling pieces of the courthouse bell, and enough to create 10 or 20 courthouse bells, right?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of feeling about Chicago that you get from doing that kind of research. And a lot of that feeling for Chicago comes out of the things that in these archival and museum and other library repositories, they decide to sort of emphasize and keep. The last thing I want to say here then is, one way to think about the history of Chicago is not necessarily to go back into the archives and look, although that's a great way to look, but is to actually look at the evolution of what you've all focused on and look at the exhibits. It's fascinating to look at exhibits, what you were emphasizing in the 1970s, what you were deciding to tell us in the 1980s, what you were telling in the 2010s, because it doesn't tell the story of just, hey, we uncovered some. It's like, how do we think about Chicago now? And so I want you to think of, everybody, me and everybody else, to think about this, like, this year represents a snapshot of the way 3 people decided to talk about Chicago now. But 10 years from now, when this award is still, to go back to the Pattis, when this award is still going strong, it'll be very interesting to see what kind of books and what other kinds of materials. Maybe they'll be digital materials, maybe not. I don't know. That's up to them. But it's going to be very interesting to see. So thinking about this as a snapshot in time, enabled by places like the Newberry. I was lucky enough, for instance, to talk about my serendipitous discovery. I was lucky when the pandemic hit, and I had all these research trips planned and that didn't pan out. I was lucky enough to discover that the Newberry had online resources that I had never dreamed of, right? And so that kind of evolving, Newberry didn't have digital resources before, and that they're doing a wonderful work with. So that kind of evolution of the museums also changes the kinds of stories that can be told. And without these archives, we're just sort of, floundering. And so it's wonderful to be able to sort of talk to Paul and for all of us sort of been able to be involved in this wonderful place. And yes, the Chicago History Museum as well. So that's it for us. On to you.
Well, let's first thank Mark and Lisa Pattis, because without the largesse of the Pattis Foundation, no one would be up here. You guys would all be like trying to escape the rain or whatever you would do on a normal Saturday. I want to read one thing at the end of all this before we thank what I thought. I thought this format was great. Yes? And I think it goes to some, Ben Heck's papers are here, along with his Oscar, the first Academy Award for screenwriting. When someone asked, he was famous for writing a column in the Daily News called 1001 Afternoons. He never wrote 1,000 columns, but it was called 1001 Afternoons. And the famous editor, Henry Justin Smith, was once asked, well, what was Heck up to? What was he up to? It is something that I think the three of you are up to, and anybody who cares about telling stories about Chicago should be up to. Here's what he said. He said, Ben was operating on the idea that just under the edge of the news as commonly understood, the news often flatly, unimaginatively told, lay life. That in this urban life there dwelt the stuff of literature, not hidden in remote places either, but walking the downtown streets, peering from the windows of skyscrapers, sunning itself in parks and boulevards. He was going to be its interpreter. He was to be the lens, throwing city life into new colors. His, the microscope, revealing its contortions in life and death. That, of course, was written in a time when this was a journalistic wonderland. So I don't know what anybody would have to say now, but it says something to me that such a large crowd gathered. It says something to me that the Pattises fund these awards. It says something else to me, that you three tell great stories that should be purchased in their books, which are out there. Thank you.
Before we do a final round of thanks, I just have a couple of quick announcements. As Rick has mentioned, there is going to be a small reception and book signing of all the books. And I also encourage you to go into our bookshop because we have the books of prior award winners in the bookshop as well. I also would like to call your attention to our exhibit, Winging It, which is free and open to the public. And we are very glad to be able to say that the curator, Bob Dolgan, is here this afternoon. So if you go to the exhibit and have any questions, feel free to ask him anything that you might want to know about what's there or perhaps what might not have made it there. I also just would ask you to look at the back of your programs. We have some wonderful events that are coming up. We hope to welcome you back to the Newberry soon. And with that, let us give first a round of applause to Lisa and Mark for founding this award. Let us give a round of applause for the three wonderful authors that we are honoring. And a round of thanks to all who participated in this afternoon's activities. So thank you very much.